My name is Tony Peterson. I'm Managing Fellow of the Overby Center. Today, we are pleased to present Tragedy on Trial, a program dealing with a series of tragic events in the state of Mississippi that had far-reaching effect on civil rights in the United States. In the interest of time, I'll give a very brief introduction to our program guest. More complete bios are available on the Overby Center website. We welcome to the Overby Center Ronald Collins, author of the recently published Tragedy on Trial, the story of the infamous Emmett Till murder trial. Ron is author of 13 books. His work on free speech, civil rights, and constitutional law have appeared in leading academic journals and in major national publications. He taught constitutional law at the University of Washington and was a Thomas Gray Fellow at Stanford Law School. Later, he was senior scholar at the museum's First Amendment Center in Washington, D.C. Our moderator is Otis Sanford, Professor Emeritus in Journalism at the University of Memphis and author of the acclaimed book, From Boss Crump to King Willie, How Race Changed Memphis Politics. Otis formerly served as managing editor, editorial page editor, and viewpoint columnist for the Commercial Appeal in Memphis. He's a graduate of the University of Mississippi and a member of the Overby Center panel of experts. Professor Sanford, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tony, and good afternoon to each and every one of you. It's a pleasure to see you. Ronald, good to see you for the first time.
The pleasure is mine.
Mine too.
By the
You
way,
want to start with a shout out?
I do, yeah, I'd like to do. First of all, it is, I mean, if you're writing about the Emmett Till story, where's ground zero? Mississippi. So, you know, it's really a particular honor to be here, and to be here at the Overby Center. I had the honor of working with Charles at the Freedom Forum for about a decade when I was in Washington, D.C. So, Tony, thank you very much for all the hard work you've done. I really appreciate that. Otis, a big thank you. We've talked before, and I think tonight's going to be a lively evening, and that's only based on what I know, not what I don't know. Earlier today, I had the opportunity of working with folks at the law school, and so that was a great privilege. And also working with Patrick Weems of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, who has done so much important work having to do with Emmett Till, and particularly seeing that the state courthouse became a national monument. And Patrick told me that we have a special guest with us tonight, and that is Jack Smith. Jack, would you just stand up for a moment? I just want people to know who this man is. This is the son of one of the special prosecutors, or the special prosecutor, Robert Smith. Robert Smith did a phenomenal job in a very hard case in prosecuting this case, a case that was impossible to win because of certain things that had been done beforehand. And your father is someone whose name should not be lost to time. And it's a great honor for me to, among other things, reconstruct the closing arguments, which were not included in the trial's transcript. And the person that gave the final closing arguments on behalf of the state was your father. So please join with me in special applause.
It's a pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Smith. And I want to begin by reading the first two sentences of the prologue to the book. And this is the quote. Time does not turn backward, but memory does. When memory is erased, however, the past dies with it. I found that statement really to be somewhat of a master narrative to the murder of Emmett Till, and really sort of a coordinated effort to basically erase the murder and really erase Till himself from history and therefore from memory. Is that an accurate statement? And if it is, elaborate on that.
Well, first of all, I don't know that I could write that statement again. I mean, you have to be in a certain frame of mind. And if you ask me, can you come up with a good opening line? I don't know, that I could do it again. It sounded pretty good when you read it.
Oh, it sounds great. And I did read it pretty well, didn't I?
You did agree. I would have liked this guy. We should go on the road together. So much of history is a work in progress. You look under a rock and something turns out new. You open a chest, somebody has long lost papers, and all of a sudden they come to the surface. And all of a sudden, history is evolving. And history, there's always things in history that we're not going to like. If we're black, we're white. If we're Jewish, we're Muslim, Christian. There's always going to be things that our predecessors did that we're not going to like. And that's just part of the human experience. And I think we have to, if we're going to be fair brokers, if we're going to try to pursue justice, we have to come to grips with that. That's the bad news. The good news is that you find heroes. You find people who light that fire in your heart and who inspire you. And so, as difficult as it was to write this book, when you're talking about the savage murder of a 14-year-old boy that took hours and hours and hours, then to throw that body in Tallahatchie and that body would, float in that river and then come back and you couldn't even tell if it was a human being. It's not easy writing about that sort of thing. On the other hand, you come to people, and we're going to be talking about some of those people today, who, like Robert Smith, did the best they could at the right time against all odds. And that sort of thing, I think, is very inspiring.
Right, it is. We have a timeline that I'm going to put on the screen and keep it on there for a while so that the audience can look at it at your leisure. We're not going to go through it as we talk, but as we talk, you can look at the timeline from 1955 all the way up to 2023, which leads me into my next question, and it's certainly for the younger people in this audience. Why is this story relevant in 2024?
Why is justice relevant in 2024?
Great answer.
Don't ask me to repeat it. So I like to say, and I had the opportunity to say it earlier today at the law school, and Dean, thank you very much for hosting the events today there. I really appreciate that. The dead live on the lips of the living. And there are certain things, there are certain stories that have to be retold time and time again. And they have to evolve, right? And evolve in ways that those living yesterday could never have imagined. So I think the Till story is a story, first and foremost, about justice and injustice, all right? These are continuing themes. It's a story about racism and those who perpetuated it and perpetuate it to this day, and those who fought against it and did their best to bring about a new day and to direct the art of justice in a way that could make us all proud. The Till story, in so many ways, resurrects itself time and again. It resurrects itself in terms of what can be taught in a classroom, what books can be used in a library. I suspect that if the Till story were told in its true form in certain high school texts, that it would be prohibited as a matter of law, maybe even in this state. I was just in Tennessee. I was certainly there as well. That's erasing history, all right?
Right.
And I think that sort of thing doesn't make us better. It makes us worse. It perpetuates a certain type of injustice and racism. And I said earlier today at the law school, Simone Weil, a noted political activist, French activist, Weil, W-E-I-L in English, she once said that there are certain evils that once they're put in motion, take months or years or decades or even a century before that evil is put to rest. And I think in so many ways, the Emmett Till story is one of those stories. I mean, if you just think about the sorts of, in our own lifetime, the sorts of cruel, unjust, racist sort of things that have happened to people of color or to others, I think the Till story is important to keep in mind, to kind of set the backdrop for that sort of thing. And I know as one who taught law, it's a story, I'm surprised that it's a story not to be found in law books. It's a story not to be found in a lot of civil rights books, except maybe it gets a line or two. And yet it's so more important, far more important for reasons that we'll say in a moment.
Right, right. And just for some context, I was 2 years old when Emmett Till was murdered. And I lived about 40 something miles from where he was murdered. That's the context of me and my family to the story. But the thing that I found fascinating about the book is that it was the full transcript of the trial. Now, I covered the courts for about 7 years as a reporter, and so I'm enthralled by trial transcripts. I've read them a lot. But you said at the end of the book that several publishers said no to the book because they said nobody is going to read a full trial transcript. Yet you persisted. Why did you persist to get the book done in the way that it was done?
I'm going to answer that in a moment, but I don't have the quote on the tip of my tongue, but I will have it before we're done. There's something from John Lewis that I have to remember to quote, and my wife Susan has reminded me that too often I've forgotten. So because I think John Lewis said something just before he died, which ties George Floyd, Emmett Till, and everybody, and is a direct answer to your question. Mm-hmm. So Susan, I have not forgotten, just give you some point. This is my 13th book. I think it's the most important by far. And yet trade publishers that I'd worked with and university publishers, including some of the major ones, said, trial transcripts don't sell. Right. You know, I said, well, this is not your typical trial transcript. This is the Emmett Till transcript. It's been missing for a half century. It's never been published. Nobody's ever given an extended treatment. Trial transcripts don't sell. And I said, well, but I didn't just publish the transcript. It's heavily annotated. I broke it into 12 parts. I've written introductions to it. The closing arguments were never recorded by the court reporter. By going to the African-American newspapers and writers at the time, I was able to reconstruct them, including the fact that Robert Smith, I got his main arguments. And I said, this is something that needs to be out there. Trial transcripts don't sell. If you want to write a 250-page high narrative, high action narrative, and have little snippet quotes and what have you, that we're interested in. But the trial transcript, thanks to Prozac and a supportive wife, I made it through, and a law book publisher, Caroline Acquitted Press, agreed to publish it. One final thing, because of some friends, they introduced me to Lonnie Bunch, who's the secretary of the Smithsonian, and the man who played knew Mamie Till, and he played a major role in the founding of the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. They introduced me to him. They provided him with the manuscript. And at one point when we were on a Zoom call, he said to me, I consider this transcript and this publication to be a historic moment. And I said, if you don't see my face on the screen in 5 seconds, it's because I passed out. So, I think it's a foundational document. It needs to be out there, but it can't stand alone naked. A lot of people had written about Emmett Till, right. But I thought as a law professor, what could I bring to the table that others hadn't? So,
and again, the transcript to me is riveting. To go back, it's almost like you're going back and you are reliving the trial and you are there. I thought it was a brilliant move.
But speaking of you were there, you could go to the courtroom there that has been preserved and is now a national monument, thanks largely to Patrick Weems and others. So please go to that courtroom and visit the Emmett Till Interpretive Centers. Right.
Good.
What do you got for me next?
Well, let's talk about some of the characters or some of the people who figure prominently in this story, in this sad story. And let's start with Mamie Till Mobley.
So we're going to go from grace to evil?
Yes, we're going to go from grace to evil. The thing that struck me, and I think I knew this already, when she was on the witness stand, she came across as probably the most graceful, intelligent witness of all the witnesses in my mind. Is that a fair statement to say?
That is a fair statement. I mean, we could talk a little later about how she was treated. By the way, all of the African-American witnesses were always referred to by their first name or a nickname. They were never addressed by their surname. And the white witnesses were always addressed as Mr. or Miss or Mrs. by their surname. And this was just part of the times. So let's talk a little bit about Mamie Till, then Bradley, later Mobley, Mamie Till Mobley. This woman's role in history has been recounted many times, but not enough times.
Yeah.
I mean, so just imagine your son leaves Chicago and goes with his great uncle, and he's going to Mississippi. The mothers warned him beforehand. I mean, Emmett was a pretty carefree, uninhibited young boy, used to Chicago values, not used to Mississippi values. And she warned him, about certain do's and don'ts. If you're walking on the same side of the street as a white person is walking toward you, walk away, cross the street, put your head down, address them this way or that way. What all Black families know is that, quote, talk, all right? And so you can imagine she gets the call that her son has not only been savagely beaten, but has been murdered. She gets on a train, comes to Mississippi, and claims the body and takes it back to Chicago. But there's a little glitch. It was unlawful for her to remove the body. The sheriff, about whom, and that takes us from grace to evil, and we'll talk about him a little later.
Yeah, we'll talk about him.
Had ordered that the coffin be sealed under, quote, authority of law, and that it could not be opened, and it had to be buried immediately. So the only way that she was able to get the body out was to sign a statement, a declaration under perjury, under threat of prosecution, that the coffin wouldn't be opened. She takes the coffin, puts it on a train. People had raised money to pay for that train ride. And she decides two things: that she's going to let a photographer from Jet magazine, Dave Jackson, take photos. I mean, this face, the body, you couldn't tell if it was a white person, a Black person. You couldn't tell if it was a young man or an old man.
Right.
It was hard to tell, except for the torso, that it was even a human being. The face was that bad.
Right.
And when they first took the body out of the Tallahatchie, the odor was so strong that 20 feet away it was toxic. And she wanted, even before the open casket funeral, she wanted those images taken. And now he was a photographer for Jet magazine. Dave Jackson was a photographer for Jet magazine, owned by Robert Johnson, also Ebony. And so early on, Mamie was thinking about, this story isn't going to die like 500 other lynchings in Mississippi. 500 lynchings happened. Nobody had paid attention to it. This story wasn't going to die that way. So even before she would have what she would do in the next day is even more significant. It occurred to her that she wanted these images and this brutality to be recorded for history. And that's where the photographer, and we're in a journalism school, right?
Right.
The photography, you will see, is of extreme importance, and it hasn't received the recognition that it needs to receive. She decides to have an open casket funeral. She said, look, I want the world to see what they've done to my boy. Tens of thousands of people, mostly African-American, came to that funeral. There's a video of it on YouTube. People were passing out. Can you imagine mothers bringing their children to look at that coffin, that open casket funeral? And what happened with that? The story, this is all before the trial.
Yeah.
The trial hasn't begun yet, right? The grand jury is still being impounded. This story went national and international. And what do we call that in the First Amendment world, an area that I've taught? When somebody does something like that, well, it's expression, right? We have the words of the First Amendment right here. It's what we in the law world called symbolic speech, right? A black armband, symbolic speech. Burning a draft card, symbolic speech.
Right.
Open casket funeral, symbolic speech. Right. And I think that decision proved to be, that's why the national press came and covered the Till trial. But for that, we wouldn't have known of it. And whatever happened to those photos that David Jackson took? They appeared in Jet magazine. Jet magazine was a magazine that published largely entertainment, sports, social things. Mm-hmm. But Robert Johnson decided, I want those photographs I want them in my magazine. It was a small magazine, just very small, it cost 15 cents. And Black people, everybody in those days read it, 400,000 copies. So if you're a person of color, you're receiving that and you're kind of going through all of this, and all of a sudden you see this along with a story. So think about that. Again, this is journalism. This is photography, right? Why isn't this story in more journalism books? Why isn't it in more law school books in terms of symbolic expression? The First Amendment isn't just what lawyers and judges do, as important as that it is. It's also what we, the people, do with it. And at that pinpoint in time, look at what Robert Jackson was doing with it. Look what Robert Johnson was doing, look what David Jackson was doing with it. Look what Robert Johnson was doing with it.
Right.
Look what maybe Till was doing with it. And I think the First Amendment becomes vibrant when you think of it from that perspective, not to undermine the importance of what lawyers and judges do. And so for me, what Mamie Till did at that pinpoint in time, if you asked me, when did the modern civil rights movement begin? Did it begin with Brown v. Board in 1954, where the court ordered the desegregation of schools? Did it begin with Rosa Parks, when she refused to sit on the back of the bus? Or did it begin with Mamie Till and that open casket funeral? For my money, that's when it began. And this is a story that cannot be told enough, and it deserves far more recognition. And I hope that those in the journalism community will think like I do, that something must be done to honor the memory of David Jackson and Robert Johnson. And so I throw it out tonight and let anyone in this room or others carry the torch.
You just answered two of the other questions that I was going to have. So thank you for that, because I was going to ask you whether this was really the actual beginning of the civil rights movement. And my contention is, yes, it is.
Yeah, it just cuts to the heart. I mean, the savagery and the grace, right? I mean, and the courage that it took. How many parents would want this kind of image portrayed to the world?
Right.
And yet
Incredible. Let me follow up on something that you just said about after the funeral or after the pictures went public, it became an international story.
Mm-hmm.
But here in Mississippi, it was ignored for the most part. And then when the national media descended on this little community for the trial, it was almost as if the officials there, even the elected officials there, were just so surprised that people would even care about this story. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, just to show you, special arrangements had to be made in the courtroom because you had all of these reporters from Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. Special arrangements had to be made so they could transmit what was going on in the courtroom back to their editors in New York or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. Mississippi, the state probably hadn't seen much of that, let alone a small town in this courtroom. It also meant that this lynching cannot go ignored.
Right.
The 500 ones before had largely gone, if not entirely gone, ignored. And so what this said to the local papers, what it said to the local officials, make of these two men what you will, but this story isn't going away. And I think that, and again, all of this happened before even the grand jury had been fully impaneled, let alone the trial began. So what it meant was that there was going to be, to use a phrase, eyes on the prize before it had even begun.
Exactly. Yeah. And before we get back to some of the characters that we're going to talk about, you mentioned the press. Talk a little bit about the difference that the authorities made between the white press and the black press at the trial.
So take yourself to the courtroom. The courtroom seats about 240, 250 people. There were about 400 people there. The temperature was about 100 degrees. People are smoking.
This is in August now.
Yeah. Thank you. Jump in anytime you want.
Oh,
and it's a scene. There's a little card table that's been set aside for the African American press. And when there were breaks and they got up to go to the, going to the restroom was a major deal. You had to walk up a couple blocks to go someplace, so you couldn't use the bathroom there. People would actually take their chairs. So when they came back, there wasn't a place for them to sit. The defendants, they're sitting as close to the judge as I am to this cameraman. And what are they doing? They're smoking cigars. One of them, J.W. Milam, will be actually reading the newspaper. I mean, can you imagine this? I mean, you're being tried for murder and you're reading the newspaper. Meanwhile, there are two little boys, and it's not like these were great paters, but they brought them there kind of as eye candy. And the little boys are running around with little guns, you know, as if this was some kind of game or something. Meantime, when there's a break, you know, a recess, vendors come in selling soda pop, all right? Only to white people, of course. There's a back row of the court is saved a few areas for black people. So the courtroom itself is this circus, you know, and it's just bizarre in terms of what's going on there. Then you think about, well, how does this all play out? The defense had 2 weeks to make their case. Their case was difficult the way it was, but it was even more difficult because of some shenanigans that the sheriff was doing. We're going to get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
So when you think about, now, one thing, Judge, we're going to talk about some of the characters, and if I'm getting ahead of you, let me know.
Go ahead.
Well, but,
Go ahead.
well, who are you going to ask me about next?
Well, I'm going to ask you about the sheriff, H.C. Strider.
After whom a public highway has been named in this state, and the Mississippi legislature passed a law to make that possible.
And my granddaughter is here, Michaela. It was also a private school named after Strider that started in 1971, my senior year of high school. And it was started in defiance of full forced integration in Mississippi. And as another aside, the football coach and his assistant coach and my English teacher at my public high school left that school and taught and coached at Strider Academy. So let's talk about H.C. Strider and his role in, I mean, there are a lot of words I could use for him. Obfuscation is one, tampering with evidence is another. Talk about H.C. Strider's role in making sure that injustice occurred in this case.
Well, with Strider, we go from, you know, if we had grace, and we did with Emmett Till, we have evil of the worst kind with H.C. Strider. This was a man who took racism to the next level, even in his own day. Just to show you how bad it was, he was called as a witness for the defense. He was working with the defense before the trial. He helped the defense select the jury. He made sure that certain witnesses who saw the murder were rounded up and taken to another jurisdiction, right? So they couldn't testify at trial. He originally signed the death certificate, and when he signed it, it said Emmett Till, it said a black boy, and he'd ordered that Till be sent to a black mortuary, that he be buried. But when he took the stand, he said, I can't say if this is Emmett Till or not. You know, when we pulled the body out, I couldn't say. I couldn't tell if it was a white man, a black man, if it was a boy, or, you know, so he says, and I've heard stories, he said during press conferences, I've heard stories that Emmett Till is in another state, and the NAACP has organized this, and they found a corpse, and they put it in the Mississippi, and they claimed that it was Emmett Till, and this is all the way to create race riots, you know, by the NAACP. And so that was just part of the evil that H.C. Strider did. But one of the worst things he did is he claimed jurisdiction. The murder didn't happen in his jurisdiction.
That's right.
He claimed jurisdiction, and because of that, he was able to orchestrate things. Was the case that the prosecutors had to do a difficult one? Yes. But it became impossible. I mean, even if you had an objective jury, given what Strider had done, it would have been impossible to get a conviction. And so the typical story is all white male jury. And by the way, women couldn't be in the jury in those days in Mississippi.
Right.
It took them 67 minutes or so, beginning the case, end the case. No, Strider had put the fix in really early on. Now there were some pretty evil defense lawyers as well, but the role that just imagine that the sheriff is helping select the jury for the defense. The sheriff is, absconding, seeing that certain witnesses are moved to another jurisdiction. The sheriff is contradicting his own story, creating news stories, having press conferences. He was about as evil as they come. And thereafter, after this case, he would also work with the governor of Mississippi to rally troops to perpetuate racism and fight the feds in terms of integration. And that that the state legislature should actually pass a statute. And you can go to the Mississippi Code and you'll find it there. Naming a highway after this man is an outrage. And by any standard, whatever standard you use, all right, this is evil incarnate. And that is one highway that needs to be renamed.
Absolutely.
Right.
I agree with that. Let's talk about Moses Wright. Moses Wright, the great uncle of Emmett Till, and his role both during the murder, or the night of the murder, but also his willingness to get on the witness stand and testify. Talk a little bit about Moses Wright.
One of the things about writing a book like this or reading it is, although you pay the price with your heart because of the tragedy and the brutality and the cruelty, the payoff is the inspiration. And Mose Wright is one of those people. He was Till's great uncle, and he shepherded Moses from Chicago to Mississippi. Just a little background first. When Emmett Till went into this little grocery store, we're not quite sure what happened in the store, but when he came out, and Carolyn Bryant, the woman who was in the store, whose husband owned it, when she came out, Emmett whistled at her. And let us be clear, he did whistle. I mean, some said he had a speech impediment, which he did, but he whistled. His cousins and others said he whistled. And that's why they left immediately. They didn't want to wait a moment. They realized that that sort of behavior, wouldn't get you murdered in Chicago, but definitely get you murdered in Mississippi in 1955. So they rushed him away, but they made a tragic mistake. They didn't tell Mose Wright what had happened, because if they had told him, he would have seen that Emmett, that moment, not the next morning, that moment would have been shipped out of Mississippi into Chicago. I mean, that's how dangerous it is. And so when the two thugs, Roy Bryant, all right, the Carol Bryant's husband, and J.W. Milam, her brother-in-law, when they come at 2 a.m. with guns and flashlights, Mose Wright is completely caught off guard, all right, completely off guard. And you can imagine what was going through his mind when they cart at gunpoint Emmett Till away. I mean, at that point, kidnapping is now in motion. And remember, these men will never be tried for kidnapping. They'll never be charged. They were only charged, thanks to the sheriff, with murder. And it's very significant. I talked a little about this at the law school today. But so they take Emmett away, and what follows is a brutal and savage murder. And then Mose Wright is asked to testify for the prosecution. Think about that. I mean, there was every reason to believe that he'd be murdered. I mean, every reason to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, a number of other witnesses left. They left Mississippi because it was that dangerous. And so Moe's right, and there was an old Bogart movie. It wasn't a very good movie, but in it, he had this line: "There are pinpoints in time that determine our destiny." And one of those pinpoints in time was when Moses Wright got up and pointed and said, "He did it," pointing to Roy Bryant. And there's a sketch of it, and there's a photo of it. A photographer actually, contrary to the rules of the court, it was the only one that was taken of that moment. It's an incredible moment. Yeah. And Mose Wright afterwards went back to Chicago. And then when a grand jury is impaneled in another county to consider whether or not the defendants should be charged with kidnapping, which they were not charged, the grand jury, unbelievable that this grand jury find that these two were not guilty. They confessed to Sheriff Smith that they had kidnapped the boy. But in any event, he came back from Chicago to Mississippi to testify at that grand jury trial. Thereafter, he goes back to Chicago. I recall, I think he worked in a restaurant and a couple of other places, and is a man who deserves even more credit than he's received. It was one of those people that inspire you,
No question about it. Yeah. And again, for context, the kidnapping happened in LaFleur County.
Sunflower County.
Sunflower County, I'm sorry. Right, the kidnapping was in LaFleur County, right? Murder. And then the body was found in Tallahatchie County.
Right.
That's right. And that's why there was no question that there was a kidnapping that happened. And they admitted to that.
Right.
But the grand jury decided, well, they've been acquitted of the murder, so nothing else. All right, let's go beyond that now, because get your questions ready, because I only have 2 more questions for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Let's talk about a guy by the name of William Bradford Huey, who was supposedly the guy who was going to tell the story accurately and got Milam and Bryant to admit it. And he wrote this piece for Look magazine that was hailed as this piece of journalism that was supposed to be the begin all and end all of the case. But after reading the book, and I kind of fell to that way of thinking myself, especially after the Eyes on the Prize documentary. But the way you tell it, and others, he was a scoundrel. Talk about William Bradford Huey.
It's another story that deserves to be in whatever the journalism textbooks are out there. This is the story that deserves to be there. William Bradford Huey is a freelance reporter at the time. After the 2 defendants are found not guilty of murder, notice I said just murder. I didn't say kidnapping because they'd never been charged with kidnapping. He strikes a deal with the defense lawyers and that he's going to pay them and pay the defendants money to get them to confess to killing Emmett Till. Because the doctrine of double jeopardy under the Fifth Amendment means that once you've been found not guilty, you can't be prosecuted again. Even if you admit saying, I murdered him, you still can't be prosecuted.
Right.
He arranges to get their confessions. He interviews them. He interviews some other witnesses. And he writes this story. He sells it to Look magazine. How much the editors of Look magazine knew or didn't know, I don't know. But we do know that the deal, Dave Tell, who's written an incredible book on Emmett Till, has done some research in this area. And even the contract that they had signed, that William Bradford Huey had signed with the defense lawyers, they had the rights to edit his manuscript before it went to Look magazine. So here he is writing the story. And the story would sell 6 million copies when Look publishes in January of 1956. And then another 5 million syndicated. So in 1 year, 11 million copies. Today, that would be an enormous number of copies.
Yeah.
And he has hailed then for decades and decades as this is the true story. This is the true story. This is the man. This is the journalist that got the defendants to confess. He would become so famous as a civil rights journalist that one of his books, Martin Luther King would write the foreword to. Another one of his books, Jesse Jackson would write it. And then the incredible documentary, the seminal documentary on racial injustice, Eyes on the Prize, opens with an opening scene with William Bradford Huey. And he's seen as this great civil rights journalist. The problem was that half of what he wrote was a blatant lie. Why? Well, remember, the defendants hadn't been kidnapped, hadn't been charged with kidnapping. So when he asked them, well, how did you get Emmett from point A to point C? They can't include that because the defendants could be charged with kidnapping. So he's got to artfully work around that. And then, well, where did the murder happen? Well, it happened at this barn. Well, we can't mention that because the owner of the barn and the manager of the barn, they could be charged. And if they're charged, they could flip on the defendants and accuse and say, yeah, these guys did kidnap them. So we've got to move that out of the story. Well, how did Emmett's body get in the truck? Well, we can't put that in because those guys could be charged. And if they're charged, then they could flip against the defendants. So at point after point after point, he's got to, and if you go to his papers, and they've been recently released, but Dave Tell had gone to them earlier, an incredible book that Dave Tell had done. There's evidence of this. There's evidence of William Bradford Huey actually, cleaning up everything so he can leave the impression that, oh, yes, these guys were the ones that murdered it, but he leaves out everything else, right? Wow. And did Emmett die? As he had said, was there this incredible moment where they said to him, we're going to give you one last chance, boy, right? You just fess up now, you apologize, and that purportedly Emmett smart talked them, and that's when they shot him and killed him and threw him into the Tallahatchie. He was long dead before that, That never happened. And so it is just a story about journalism that needs to be retold by journalists, it's just, we don't know how much the editors at Look magazine knew. But even if they did know, if you said, we're talking 6 million copies here, would they turn a deaf ear? I'm not saying they did. I'm just saying, think about human nature. We're talking 6 million copies plus another 5 million syndicated. That's a lot of journalism.
Unbelievable. I want to open it up to questions. Before I do, and I'm not going to ask you to respond to this, but another key element in this whole case, which really speaks to Mississippi as a whole, was the fact that they tied a gin fan around his neck when they threw him in the river. A gin fan. And think about Mississippi as the place where cotton was king. Think about that. Who has a question?
By that way, that gin fan was stolen, has never been recovered.
And it never been recovered. That's right. Questions for Mr. Collins?
I'm struck by the speed by which the defendants were indicted and tried. That obviously would never happen today. I suspect even at the time, that was a pretty fast, you look at the time that his body was recovered, the time that he was indicted, the time that he was tried. Was that a part, have you been able to piece together, was that a part of the sheriff's and the defense's strategy to try to prevent the prosecution from being able to thoroughly investigate and be able to present evidence to the jury?
The short answer is yes, but there's more to it. The court sat by terms, and there wasn't much time left in the term. So obviously the prosecution knew that they had good reason to know, and I believe they did know, that this is not the jurisdiction where the murder occurred, all right, that it occurred in another jurisdiction. So then the question is, well, why didn't they challenge that? They could have just said, Strider, you can do what you want, but we're making the call, and it wasn't in this jurisdiction. My guess is that Judge Swango, the judge, University of Mississippi grad, who was about as fair a judge as you're going to get in Mississippi in 1955. I mean, really, I had some issues with a couple of his calls, but this is true of any judge, all right? But he was remarkably fair for a judge, a white judge at that time in Mississippi. So my guess is the prosecution, I'm just guessing, figured, you know what, better to keep it in this jurisdiction and go before Swango than let it go to another jurisdiction where there's not even a hope of a chance. So the clock was ticking in terms of the court's term, and they probably figured, let's take our chances with Swango because in another jurisdiction, we're not even going to get. That's my guess, but it's a good question.
I agree. And the trial transcript shows he was about as fair as you were ever going to get for a judge in Mississippi in 1955.
And the prosecutors did as good a job as they possibly could.
Right, they did.
And, it's a sad story as to, what happened to those men in the evolution of their life. But I think what they did and is now recounted in the trial transcript, you can read for yourself. And imagine trying to get witnesses. I mean, one of the things that Smith did was that your father did was he protected those witnesses. He found them, a couple of witnesses that Medgar Evers and others from the NACP had gone out and found, and he protected them. And that alone itself was a courageous act, and at least it gave them the opportunity to testify.
Other questions?
I want to ask, I'm a very just big historical person. And so I appreciate you guys for even talking about this topic, but I'm also very understanding of a lot of governmental issues right now that are in terms of a lot of these issues are trying to be dispersed. And when I say that, I mean a lot of governments are trying to take away these history topics in schools for young people. And a lot of people are trying to act like these things were in a positive manner happen. And so I want to ask just maybe what's your take on how do you continue going about talking about these things that you're talking about and so passionate about that you learn so much about in a way that you can, in a way that is still informative to people, because these are conversations that need to be had. These things like this are things that need to be talked about that still need to be learned by the young people, because we can't go back to those times. We can't move forward if we aren't learning those things. So in a time that is in so much change, how do you continue to talk about these things in such peaceful and respectful manner?
Go ahead, Ron, and I'll have an answer to that as well.
Well, I'll let you take the lead if you want.
Well, from my perspective, and I'm a journalist, and I'm an opinion journalist. And I practice journalism in Memphis, Tennessee. And you mentioned that at the outset. Tennessee is one of those places where there has been a really strident attempt to, in my view, erase history by saying that you can't talk about these things in schools, especially in elementary schools. So what I do is I write about this kind of stuff. I mean, I don't focus on it every single day, and the columns that I write are not just fixated on it all the time. But this is important to talk about. And the very fact that we have a case that should be at the forefront of discussions about race relations, about injustice, about the legal system. It has not gotten the attention. The only thing that I can do is continue to write about it. And I do that. And sometimes to the chagrin of politicians, especially in Tennessee. But that's the only way I know how to do it, is to continue. I think it was Ida B. Wells that said, the best way to get the truth is to shine a light on it. And it is up to journalists and authors to shine a light on things that help people understand what happened in the past so that we don't repeat those atrocities going forward.
The price of letting you go first is I was going to use the shine the light metaphor myself. Right? So one of the things that journalists, historians, and others can do is, shine a light on these sorts of things. I think what the work that Patrick Weems is doing at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, all sorts of creative things they're doing, taking the Emmett Till story around the country in various informative and creative ways. I think that's really important. I think it's also important when these sorts of things happen, for example, like some of this legislation that's being passed or has been passed in this state, in Tennessee and other states, to erase history, you can't let those things sit. Put your Mamie Till Bradley hat on. Think of some creative way, to challenge that. Not necessarily in court, although that could be important as well, but kind of do it in some creative way. I think journalists have that opportunity, social activists have that opportunity, and I'm really encouraged by that sort of thing. I came to know about the Emmett Till story through Bob Dylan's song. I mean, that's how it came to me. And before I forget, I want to Susan, I have not forgotten to this time to read the passage from Congressman John Lewis. He had written this was a posthumous op-ed. So it had been written while he was alive, but published after he died. And he said, Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks. He was my Sandra Bland. He was my Brenoa Taylor, And I think that is, putting all of those names together like that, and I think John Lewis had it absolutely right. The past does repeat itself. It repeats itself in different ways. And the question that we face, the challenge that we face as lawyers, as litigators, as judges, as reporters, as poets, as playwrights, as social activists is, how do we confront that injustice, all right? And I think one of the ways we do it is by shining a light on the past. And I think we could never do that enough. And sometimes it's going to upset us, and sometimes it's going to inspire us. But at the end, it'll get us closer to the mark that we call truth.
Right. And let me also add, very briefly, that I came to this university 11 years after James married. At a time when my parents and other people were still not sure that I should be here. But I got a great journalism education here. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Department of Journalism, the law school are embracing this history from the past to help us understand what happened so that we won't repeat it. And so I give a special shout out to this university for not putting its history under a bushel basket to hide, but to put it out there so that people can understand just how far this university has come.
That was the reason for me. It was so exciting to come here. And if you remember, and there are a number of people in this audience that do remember, and others who probably don't because they weren't born yet, there was a man named Sam Cooke. And one of the things he said, it's been a long time coming, but a change is going to come.
Right.
And the only way that change comes is by precisely the sorts of things that we've been talking about. Right. And, if nothing else, I hope that Tragedy on Trial inspires, a new generation of people to kind of take their cues from the courageous people here who did the things they did. And if you haven't heard the Sam Cooke song, A Change Is Gonna Come, or Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn, check it out. It may offend you, but it'll inspire you afterwards.
Right. I saw a hand right here. Yes.
I'm curious about the actions of this jury. And I wonder if, first of all, was there ever any evidence that this jury was tampered that you saw uncovered anywhere? Or was it a case of the transcript showing that the prosecution just did not present strong enough case? Or C, was this just a sign of the times? I mean, was this just the way it went in 1955, and this is what was going to come back from this jury?
How do you answer that, Ron?
So C, yes, it was a sign of the times.
Yeah.
B, the prosecution, I think, did the best with what they had. And the operative words are with what they had. Right. the tampering, it's interesting you should raise that question because as Patrick Weems and others are working on right now, there is increasing evidence that there might have been tampering with the evidence. Remember, the sheriff helps help the defense pick the jurors. I've noticed more recently after I wrote the book that one of the defense lawyers was the person who worked for the county who actually selected the grand jury pool, not the particular grand jury. I said grand jurors, I meant jurors. And so the more we think about that, the more we might come to the conclusion that if there was jury tampering, one of the possible, and Dean, I say possible ways to get around the double jeopardy argument is that if the verdict was the response or was due to jury tampering, then double jeopardy, at least according to a Seventh Circuit opinion and another one, other state court opinions, maybe that's an argument around double jeopardy. So, people are now looking under those stones, and who knows what they're going to find, but it's certainly something that right now, at this moment, is in play.
We have 1 minute left, so one last question.
Okay, I just wanted to thank both of you for the work that you're doing, and you're putting it in writing for us to read and understand for the future. But I do have a question for the author, for Ronald Collins. What made you want to have the compassion to even write this literature for us to read?
Well, I literally am glad you asked that question. Sometimes people say that it's not true, but I am glad you asked because it gives me an opportunity yet again to give another shout out to my wife, Susan Cohen, who has devoted her life to social activism in her own world having to do with women's rights and reproductive rights. But Susan wanted to take a civil rights tour. And I said, that's fine, and so we were going to all of these places and then we came to Mississippi and we came to the courthouse, and I'm a law professor. And I said, wow, this is where it happened. And there was a gentleman from the Emmett Till Interpretive Center that was speaking there that day. And the more he spoke, and I was sitting in this courtroom, and all of a sudden, I wasn't planning to write a book. It's not like I woke up and said, well, somebody needs to write it. So that night I was so taken. I was on the internet, and one thing led to another, to another, to another. And the next thing I know, I was teaching a class on the Emmett Till. And then I taught another class on the trial. And I thought, well, since I've done all of this work, let's do a book. And that's how it happened. And the proximate cause, like so many other things in my life, was due to my wife, who inspired us and took us on this civil rights tour. And thanks to the folks at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, because that's what inspired me to write the book. But for that, the last thing I needed to do, because I was already overcommitted, was to commit to another book. So thank you for asking the question.
And let me close with this. Ron and I, we had never met until today. But we spent about an hour on the phone after I had written the book to talk about what we wanted to talk about today. But I would imagine that we spent about 20 minutes of that hour talking about Motown. Because this man knows as much about Motown music, almost as much as I do. And so let's thank Ronald Collins for coming to Ole Miss today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Gentlemen, thank you. Our time is up. Dr. Donald Cole, would you stand up? Given the topic of this, it is more than appropriate that we recognize you. Your history of civil rights on this campus and in this state is something to be congratulated. And thank you for everything that you've done. Professor Emeritus in mathematics on this campus, and also a member of the Overby Center Board of Trustees. Dr. Donald Cole, thank you.